It's a marathon, not a sprint. Here's some.
The median price of a 3-bedroom rental in Cambridge, Massachusetts today is $3,500. This is Renters Matter. I'm Chris Schmidt. I'm your host tonight, talking about something a little bit different than we usually talk about. We're going to be talking about current events, not just in the political sphere, not what we could do, but what we need to be doing now. Earlier today, I was reading a story about a current case where an apartment building was bought. It's down in a town whose name I have failed to remember, but what's happened to the residents of that apartment building is that they have had a massive increase in rent, and they have been evicted by the new owner of the property with effectively no notice. The new owner came in, bought the apartment building for, Brockton. The building is down in Brockton. A 6-unit apartment building down in Brockton, bought along with the single-family home behind it for $770,000. And the new owner of the property came in, bought the property, didn't fix anything, didn't do anything, came in and said, okay, your rent is doubling. You're paying $850 a month now. Next month, you're going to pay me $1,500 a month. And by the way, here's an eviction notice to go along with that. Now, getting an eviction notice obviously doesn't mean you're evicted. If you receive an eviction notice, you should be aware of your rights. And this is actually something that I think we'll talk about what that means. But just because these people have received an eviction notice does not mean that they necessarily are going to have to leave their apartments. Eviction is a time-consuming process. And so in this case, it's possible that the landlord has served the eviction notice on the assumption that the tenants won't be able to pay the rent, and is attempting to kind of move things along. So just figured, all right, they're not going to be able to pay the rent. I know they're not going to be able to pay the rent. I'm just going to, go ahead and I'm going to evict them along with raising the rent. It's also possible something else is going through his mind, because I can't actually put myself in the mind of someone who would walk in and immediately, evict a whole bunch of tenants in a building he just bought. I can't think like that. Now, the property in question is, a 6-unit apartment building, and the tenants were paying a very low amount of rent, $850 a month for rent, anywhere in the Boston area, even when you're in Brockton, which is a fair ways out of Boston and not as accessible, is still very low. And so the price that he's raising it to is not, in and of itself, completely out of line. And in fact, there's no way that, he will be able to maintain the property in a way that, allows him to do maintenance and other things like that with the amount of money that he was getting, most likely from the tenants. Realistically, he wouldn't even be able to pay the mortgage on the place he bought with the amount of income that the tenants were generating under the previous lease. And the reason that this worked out for the previous owners, because they bought it at a much lower price. They didn't pay $770,000 for it. They paid $200,000 for it in kind of the depths of the financial crisis in 2008. And so, as the price has gone up, when a new owner comes in, that they don't really have the option, without just paying out of pocket, which most apartment landlords are not interested in doing, of not raising the rent. That would have been a long-term bad solution for the tenants. What happens in these cases is that they do let repairs go, or in some cases the properties, fall into disrepair, costly legal proceedings, other kinds of stuff that can go wrong. So you really don't want your landlord to be in a position where they're losing money on your property every month, because that's going to cause them to behave in a whole bunch of bad ways. So that's not a good thing. But it's also obviously not a good thing to have your rent basically double overnight. That's just, nobody can react to that. Nobody is designed to respond to that level of increase. It's just not tenable for them to do so. And so this is one of those cases where, I have expressed concern around rent control. I know that there's a lot of different feelings about it, but one thing that I feel very confident of, one thing that I feel very strongly about, is that every tenant would be better off if, rather than one lump sum increase in rent that comes every 5 years or 10 years, if properties were seeing increases in rent over time. if you were to spread that out over time so that tenants don't have the situation where suddenly they've got to double the amount that they're paying every month or be evicted right away, but instead can say, okay, it went up by $50 a month this year, and next year it'll go up by another $50 a month, and I know that, and I can start looking around to find something else. The inconsistency of rent increases is what causes people to be in situations where they're suddenly in an emergency situation where they have to switch to different housing. Now, in this particular case, it seems like a lot of these tenants have been there for a long time, in some cases a decade or more, and as a result, they're people who have been paying significantly below the market rate for a long time, but they don't have income to support this, and with ability to pay $850 a month is not going to find you an apartment pretty much anywhere. And so several of these tenants are going to be looking to public housing. At least one was already a Section 8 voucher holder whose voucher would actually cover the increase in price, but the new landlord came in and said, well, I'm going to make the rule that there's no dogs. So when you want to renew your lease, that's fine, but the new lease says that no dogs are allowed in this apartment complex. And so this family who had been living here for years and years, 7 years, was asked to get rid of their dog. They were forced to sign a new lease, and so they had to pay first, last, and security, even though they were already living in the apartment, and had a number of these other things going on. And this is the City Life Vita Urbana is a tenants advocacy org that works throughout the Boston area, and I think has commented on this case. I don't know if they're working with them, but it attempts to provide kind of access to resources and provide access to information that can help tenants in these situations better deal with and find out what their legal rights are. Now, I mentioned earlier that just because you receive an eviction notice that says you must be out by a certain time doesn't mean that you have to be out by that time. If you fight an eviction notice, you can slow things down. You can cause the landlord to have to take you to court, to have to be involved, and to go through a legal proceeding to actually evict you. And so this is one of the reasons why I say when you get an eviction notice, you should really get advice from someone who is trained in these areas, from a tenant, from a real estate, a lawyer who works with tenants, on what your legal rights, obligations, etc. are, what opportunities and avenues you may have available to you. And in this case, like I said, this landlord seems like they're being extreme in how quickly they are acting, or in the ways in which they're acting, and which is a really just an irresponsible way to behave as a landlord. And I know landlords who are not like that. My dad manages a whole bunch of properties out in Illinois where I grew up, and I know that he would never think about coming in and coming into a purchased property with an existing tenant and saying, I'm going to change all the rules on you, I'm going to double your rent, and I'm going to serve you an eviction notice without even talking to you. Like, that's just completely beyond the fold, and just really unfair. When you're looking at a tenant who has been living in some place for many years, is by no means established as a bad tenant, has a housing voucher that allows them to pay your increase in rent, the fact that you're serving them with an eviction notice without even having a conversation with them is just irresponsible. And I just have so much anger and frustration at this type of behavior from a landlord, at this type of behavior from someone who has taken on the responsibility of providing housing for somebody, because housing is a base need. Housing and shelter is a base need. And so if you are going to sign up to do the job, if you're going to sign up to buy a building with tenants in it, if you're going to sign up and say, this is the thing I want to do, you have a responsibility. You have a responsibility to the people who live there, not to let them live there forever, not to make no changes, not to do anything else, but you have a responsibility to treat that with the respect that it deserves. And when you come in there and you say, I know best and you're out, or I know best and I don't think you can pay this, or I know best, and all this stuff, because you want to come in and you want to make more money and you're not willing to act in a responsible way towards these tenants who have lived here for a decade, that's unacceptable. That is unacceptable. And this is where I get upset. This is where I get angry. Not at the small landlords who own a couple of properties, not at the big landlords who follow all the rules that establish things up front, not at the people who are, making money even off of tenants. I honestly don't really have the same level of problem with someone who just increases the rent because they know they can and they want to make more money. I don't care about that in the same way, so long as they're doing it responsibly, so long as they're doing it in a way that gives tenants the chance to react, so long as they're doing it in a way that is giving those tenants an opportunity to say, what is my plan here, and react to it. So that when someone comes in and says, hey, I'm going to raise the rent by 50% or 40% overnight, that's just not something that you do. And to see that happening, and to see, that we don't have in place protections that would require a landlord to have some reason, like you can't pay the rent increase, or can't have something that says like you're being a bad like that there's no limitations on the fact that a landlord can just snap their fingers and say, you're done now. And that a landlord would choose to make that choice, that makes me upset. And this is where I think rent control rules and just cause eviction rules and increased tenant protections really come into play. It's not about, you cannot keep the price of apartments steady via price controls. You can't. Because as I pointed out, like the costs of maintaining properties will go up as they're bought and sold. They're not like as the value of housing continues to increase because we don't have enough supply of it. Like you will not be able to just freeze rents in place forever. It will create negative consequences. It's just not gonna work. But you can establish a set of rules that establishes a set of norms around how much rent can increase, how much and how quickly you can increase rent, whether you can evict someone who can pay an increased rent for no reason. And the reality is that without the combination of these tools, many of them don't really work, right? Like if you have just cause eviction, right? So you say you have to have some cause in order to evict somebody. Okay, well, but that doesn't work if one of the causes that is open to you is, I tripled the rent and they didn't want to pay a triple rent, so now they're no longer, renting my property, right? Like if you go take the rent from $3,000 a month to $6,000 a month, almost any tenant is going to say, I can't pay that, and the landlord, I think, has to be able to evict someone for non-payment of rent. So without some kind of controls on pricing here, then tools like just cause eviction requirements, which can help tenants or force landlords to have some reason to evict you, are less effective, because raising the price will always be effectively a deterrent on allowing tenants to stay in their place. So the combination of a variety of tools becomes important. Another thing that I think is really important is to communicate some of these things to people who are suffering from eviction proceedings, right? I just said that, if someone wants you out, it is not the case that necessarily just because they say you must be out by December 1st, you must be out by December 1st. If you proceed in pushing back, you can go through a proceeding where, you have to go to court, where you have to get scheduled, where you can say, hey, it's winter and there's no apartments. You can't just put me on the street, especially for these tenants who are low-income housing or don't have access to affordable housing in the place where they live, where you can say, like, hey, this is an unreasonable request, and seek, forbearance from the court from an eviction proceeding, where you can get assistance from a lawyer to proceed through a discovery phase that allows you to get information from the landlord and attempt to find a negotiated position that will allow you to work together to stay in the home. These are all really, really important things to be working on and have access to, and information that most tenants don't have. So one of the things that I am very, very strongly in favor of is that with every lease renewal, and especially with every eviction notice, but with every lease renewal, because I think this is actually a really common way of effectively performing evictions without proceeding through eviction, is to hand someone a lease and say, hey, the price is going up, and then the tenant effectively self-evicts because they know they can't pay that price, and so they go and have to find housing elsewhere. They don't necessarily realize, like, what happens if I say no. And so I think with every lease and every lease renewal, I think that landlords who are taking on a responsibility as a particular type of business owner working in a space where there is a greater need to protect people's access to this resource than in a typical business, that they should have a requirement to give you that information, which I don't think they necessarily need to produce that. I would hope that the state or the city can produce something that gives the information that is relevant here to help tenants understand what happens if I don't sign a new lease. Will you go month to month on your current lease, on the current terms of your current lease? Okay, well, what happens after that? Like, what happens if the landlord wants the rent to go up? Well, if you don't want to pay the new rent, they can't force you to accept a new lease, and they would have to, at that point, choose to evict you. If you continue to pay the rent under the current terms of the month-to-month lease, then they would have to go through an eviction proceeding, and the eviction proceeding can take months. At one point, I received a ill-formed notice to quit by my landlord, and so I went to an attorney. This was a long time. This is 8-9 years ago. I went to an attorney and said, "Hey, my landlord sent me an email saying my sister is going to buy the house. You need to move out in 2 weeks. What is the path here?" And I was lucky that I was able to do that. It was a stretch because just getting feedback on what was legal or what was allowed was something where we had to pay a small retainer to the lawyer to give us this advice. And he said, "Look, like, they're not going to get you out by 2 weeks from now because realistically they haven't even given you a notice to quit yet, much less an eviction. And if you were to fight this to the bitter end, it's likely that it's August, September now, and it's likely that you could delay this until like after the holidays into the new year, which would give you ample opportunity to explore finding new housing, finding another place to live, finding a way to move. But you will lose access to that housing eventually. If an owner wants you out, you will lose access to that housing. And in the meantime, don't do anything wrong. Pay your rent on time. Continue to make sure that you're keeping up the property. Don't do anything that could be construed as breaking the lease, the terms of the lease, because that makes your situation much more tenuous, right? And this is like, I'm reciting back to like a decade ago. I don't remember all this, so if you're going through an eviction proceeding, talk to a real lawyer and not just watch me on this, community access television show. Before this was Cooking World, after this is Plant World. Just kidding. Like these things are complicated, and I don't know the rules. And I don't expect that most people know the rules. And that's actually one of the reasons why I think when you get a lease renewal, understanding what the rules are, what your options are, is actually really important. It's really important to be able to have that information so you can make a decision and say, okay, how much time do I have to move? What are my negotiation points? What are my possible access to resources to make this better? And so in some cities, they've proceeded to have an Office of Housing Stability, which I think Cambridge should also have, where these resources can be kind of collected. They collect data, they collect resources, and provide access and information to tenants on what resources are available and act as a clearinghouse for those resources. Because there are really a lot of resources available, especially for low-income tenants, for legal resources, for assistance with these things, for lawyers who can help you out with this stuff. Those resources are available. And Cambridge, I know right now, is expanding on those opportunities. And there are organizations like City Life Vita Urbana that can act as a way to do better. When I went to the rally for tenant protections at the State House the other day, the City Life organizers came out and said, it's so painful when people come into our space, and we meet every week, and every week there's someone coming in who's suffering under eviction, and we have to tell them, like, it's not your fault. It's not your fault that this is going on. It's not your fault that this is happening to you. It's not your fault that you're going through this process. And just the waves of relief in some people's faces when they realize it's not their fault. It's really not. In cases where a new owner comes in and drastically changes the rules of the game that you've been living under for years, that's not your fault. that we have a system set up where landlords have, effectively limitless power on raising rents, or in the end, evicting tenants even when they plan to continue to, rent the space. That's not your fault. The fact that there's not enough housing, and so when you look around, there won't be enough space in public housing. There won't be apartments that you can live to. You may have to leave your town, leave your community, leave your friends behind. That's not your fault. And that's not to say that it's some evil landlord's fault or some other. It's the realities of the system that we've built that don't have protections, but more importantly, don't have standards in place for what is acceptable behavior. And so a lot of landlords think, well, it's worse for the tenant if I raise the rent every year, because then they're going to be paying this money all along, when I can just hold off and I can keep the rent low and I can keep them happy, and that works great for them, and it sort of works great. One of the reasons I was able to stay in Cambridge for as long as I did was because I was in a place where the rent never went up. I lived there for 8 years, from 2006 to 2014, and the rent never went up. But on the other hand, that meant that when, my landlord decided her sister needed a place to live, that I was paying significantly below market rate rent, and that probably factored into the decision. In the end, my landlord got a divorce, and so we had to move, because they were like, well, we're not going to keep renting because we're getting divorced, and we have to deal with splitting up the assets as part of the divorce. My former apartment is now a 2-unit Airbnb, where the landlord lives in this one small room that he's carved off from this now 2-unit whatever. It's kind of silly. Just some of the things that people do to add more bedrooms in an Airbnb rental, just crazy, I tell you. So these things weren't my fault. When my landlord decided, I'm going to give you a week and a half of notice before you have to leave your apartment, and then changed her mind 3 days later, by the way, thankfully for me. So I went and talked to a lawyer, and 3 days later she's like, oh no, never mind. It's like, do you realize how much, how much of a toll that had, even just for that short period of time? And then you look at the people who are dealing with this for a much longer period of time, like these residents in Brockton who are being evicted, who are basically looking at spending Christmas homeless, because a new property owner came in and did not plan around slowly, gradually increasing rents, did not plan around bringing things back up to a level where the property was sustainable, basically did not do any work to attempt to make a smooth transition. And that preventing assholes like that from being able to just walk in and do whatever they want is the reason why I'm in favor of anti-gouging controls or rent control or whatever you want to call it, so that you do establish a norm that says 5% or 10% or whatever the number is the amount that rent should go up. And if you're paying $850 a month and the landlord wants it to be $1,500 a month, that they should know when they're buying this property that they're going to have to do some work to buy you out to get there, that they're going to have to do some work to negotiate with you, because otherwise they're going to have to spend the next 5, 6, 7 years getting there. And in the meantime, most likely, the landlord who was there before, who realizes they're never going to be able to snap their fingers and sell their property with these much below market rate tenants, are going to gradually increase the rent. And yes, does that mean more people will over time lose their housing? Yes. When rents go up, people lose housing, and there is nothing that can be done to entirely eliminate that. Nothing. But what it does mean is that you set a standard and a norm that you can say, hey, you are behaving out of line here. You are behaving in a way that is not an experience that should be happening to these people, and you have a responsibility to them. I know you bought this building. I know you think everything's fine. I know all of that, and I don't care, because that does not give you the right to disrupt these people's homes in this way that involves you reacting to a fact of life that you could have known before buying this building. that you had to do the due diligence to recognize that you bought a building with tenants in it. You should have known what their leases were at. You should have known what rent they were paying. You should have known all of that. And if you were going to decide to raise their rent by that much, then you should have planned to say, okay, I'm going to have the first 2-3 years in the bank as I slowly raise this. And it's hard. It's hard when someone who has been maintaining a property and maintaining significantly or drastically below market rate rents for years, it is going to make it more difficult for someone to come in and do that. And realistically, the way that that's going to happen is, under the rules that we have today, is that someone's just going to come in and evict them. They're just going to say, I'm not renting anymore. I'm going to do whatever I want with this. I'm going to take it off the market. I'm going to condoize it. I'm going to repair it. I'm going to renovate it. I'm going to do whatever. And that ability there, putting things more on an even playing field, not with the normal landlord increases, not with a 3% or a 5% annual increase, which is frankly just the cost of things going up around here, but instead with the 20% and the 45% increase, and serving an eviction notice and telling someone they have to get rid of the dog in order to continue living there. Those behaviors should be unacceptable, and we should find ways to denormalize them. We should find ways to make sure that we establish that housing is not intended to be used as a tool, as a weapon to bludgeon the residents of a property that you've bought. That's not okay. Housing is a basic need for stability. It's a basic need for everyone who's participating. It's a basic need that cannot be gotten rid of by snapping your fingers and saying, now you owe me more money. That shouldn't be okay. We have to find a balance. We have to find a balance where we encourage the types of behavior we want to see. And one of the types of behavior that I think is crucial that we see is that we move away from this pretending that small landlords keep everything great by keeping rents low, and then all the prices jump up all at once, and people suffer. Because the big jumps are what cause the most suffering. Smaller jumps, where you have time to react, are a better way to go. That's why I support anti-gouging rent control. I'm Chris Schmidt. This has been Renters Matter.